The school janitor's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the check. $2,800 made out to a company that didn't exist, signed by his own trembling fingers. Tom Brennan had spent 15 years cleaning classrooms at Lincoln Elementary School, trusted by teachers and parents alike, invisible to everyone who mattered. But his wife was dying slowly from medical bills they couldn't pay, and watching her fade away had broken something inside him that he didn't know could break. Now he was standing in that grimy check-cashing store with stolen money in his hands, and he couldn't tell if the sick feeling in his stomach was from guilt or relief. What Tom didn't know was that this single desperate act would snowball into something so monstrous that it would destroy not just his life, but an entire community's faith in the people they trusted to protect their children. October 15th, 2018. Tom Brennan pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallways of Lincoln Elementary School, just as he had every weeknight for the past 15 years. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floors that would soon gleam under his careful attention. At 47, Tom had become part of the school's furniture, reliable, quiet, and utterly forgettable. Principal Martha Henley often remarked to parents during school board meetings how fortunate they were to have someone like Tom on staff. "He's been here longer than most of our teachers," she would say with genuine warmth. "The children love him, and he takes such pride in keeping our school spotless." What she didn't know was that Tom had been listening to these conversations through the thin walls of the administrative offices, absorbing every detail about the school's financial operations while emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces. Tom's life hadn't always been so small. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Angela, in 1995, full of dreams about starting a family and building something meaningful together. But 3 miscarriages and mounting medical bills had slowly drained both their bank account and their hope. By 2010, Angela had retreated into a shell of chronic pain and prescription medications, leaving Tom to shoulder their financial burdens alone on a custodian salary of $32,000 per year. The breaking point came on September 30th, 2018, when Angela's latest round of fertility treatments failed spectacularly. The doctor delivered the news with clinical precision. At 44, her chances of carrying a pregnancy to term were virtually zero. The couple sat in that sterile office, surrounded by pamphlets for adoption agencies they couldn't afford, and treatment options that might as well have been printed in a foreign language for all the financial sense they made. That night, Tom sat at their kitchen table, staring at a stack of medical bills totaling $47,000. His hands shook as he calculated and recalculated their monthly expenses against his modest income. The math was brutal and unforgiving. They were drowning, and no one seemed to notice or care. The next morning, October 1st, 2018, Tom arrived at work with a heaviness in his chest that felt like concrete. As he cleaned the main administrative office, he overheard Superintendent David Walsh discussing the district's recent budget surplus with the head of finance, Carol Peterson. "We're sitting on nearly $3.2 million in reserve funds," Walsh said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man who'd never worried about choosing between groceries and prescription medications. "Thank God for these state funding increases. We're finally in a position to really invest in our facilities." Carol nodded enthusiastically. "The technology upgrades alone will cost $400,000, but it's money well spent. These kids deserve the best we can give them." She gestured toward a stack of purchase orders on her desk. "I've never seen our cash flow this healthy. It's almost embarrassing how much surplus we're carrying." Tom's hands froze on his cleaning cloth. 3.2 million. The number echoed in his mind as he continued his work, moving like a ghost through offices where people discussed amounts of money that could solve every problem in his life 100 times over. These were the same people who praised his dedication while paying him barely enough to survive. The irony wasn't lost on him. He knew more about the school's inner workings than most of the administrators who made decisions behind closed doors. As Walsh and Peterson continued their conversation, discussing new playground equipment and building renovations, Tom felt something dark and bitter growing in his chest. Here they were, casually talking about spending hundreds of thousands on upgrades while he couldn't afford to fill Angela's prescription for pain medication. The disconnect between their world and his reality felt like a physical wound, raw and burning. "The best part," Walsh continued, "is that the state auditors won't be back for another 18 months. We have plenty of time to implement these improvements and show real results." The superintendent's casual mention of the audit timeline felt like a sign, a window of opportunity that wouldn't remain open forever. Over the following weeks, Tom began paying closer attention to the conversations happening around him. His position as night custodian granted him access to virtually every room in the building, and his years of reliable service had earned him a level of trust that no one questioned. He learned that Carol Peterson, the finance director, often stayed late on Thursdays to process payroll and vendor payments. He discovered that the district's accounting software required 2 levels of authorization for payments over $5,000, but smaller amounts could be processed by anyone with the proper login credentials. Most importantly, he realized that Carol had a habit of leaving her computer logged in when she stepped away for coffee breaks or restroom visits. Tom had watched her enter her password dozens of times. Golden Retriever 2012. The name and birth year of the dog whose photo sat prominently on her desk. November 12, 2018. Tom made his first attempt. Carol had left her office to speak with a teacher about a supply order, her computer screen glowing with the district's financial management system. Tom's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached her desk. His hands trembled as he navigated to the vendor payment section and created a new entry. Brennan Maintenance Services, Facility Repairs, $2,147. The system accepted the transaction without question. Within 3 business days, a check arrived at Tom's home address. He stared at it for nearly an hour before taking it to a check cashing store on the other side of town, paying the fees with cash and walking away with more money than he'd ever held at one time. The guilt was immediate and crushing. Tom spent 2 weeks convincing himself it was a one-time desperate act, a loan he would somehow repay when their financial situation improved. But when Angela's next medical appointment resulted in another $3,000 bill, the justifications became easier to construct. December 2018 through August 2019 marked Tom's evolution from desperate husband to calculated thief. He developed a sophisticated system that exploited every weakness in the district's financial oversight. Small payments to fictional companies became his specialty: maintenance services, cleaning supplies, equipment repairs. Never more than $4,999, just under the threshold that would trigger additional approvals. Tom created an intricate network of false identities and shell companies. North Star Cleaning Solutions, Twin Cities Maintenance, and Prairie View Services all existed only on paper, with mailing addresses that led to post office boxes Tom had rented under assumed names. He studied the district's legitimate vendor list, learning the language and pricing structures that would make his fabricated invoices blend seamlessly with authentic ones. The technical aspects of the theft required Tom to become an expert in areas he'd never previously considered. He spent countless late-night hours researching business formation procedures, studying legitimate invoice formats, and learning the intricacies of the district's vendor approval processes. He purchased a high-quality printer capable of producing professional-looking documents, invested in design software to create convincing letterheads, and even bought a laminating machine to make fake business licenses appear more authentic. Tom's attention to detail was meticulous and disturbing. He researched average pricing for various maintenance services in the Minneapolis metro area, ensuring his fraudulent invoices fell within reasonable ranges that wouldn't trigger suspicion. He studied the seasonal patterns of school maintenance needs, timing his fake carpet cleaning services for summer months and heating system repairs for winter periods when such expenses would seem natural. The psychological transformation was as significant as the technical one. Tom developed elaborate backstories for his fictional companies, complete with fake employee names, phone numbers that forwarded to disposable cell phones, and email addresses that he monitored religiously. He created a complex web of business relationships, sometimes having one fake company subcontract work to another, adding layers of authenticity that made detection increasingly difficult. He opened bank accounts for his fictional companies using fake business licenses and tax identification numbers he'd obtained through online services that operated in legal gray areas. The process required him to assume multiple identities, creating driver's licenses and social security numbers for fictional business owners. Tom became skilled at forging signatures, mimicking handwriting styles, and even altering his appearance when visiting different banks to avoid recognition. By March 2019, Tom was stealing approximately $15,000 per month, but the amount varied strategically. Some months he would process smaller transactions to avoid establishing predictable patterns, while other months he would execute larger thefts when the district's budget cycles made detection less likely. He had learned to read the district's financial rhythms like a skilled musician reading sheet music. The stolen money transformed their daily existence in ways both large and small. Tom caught up on mortgage payments that had been delinquent for 8 months, preventing the foreclosure proceedings that had been haunting their sleep. He cleared their medical debt, paying off collections agencies that had been calling multiple times daily. For the first time in years, he could buy Angela the small luxuries that brought brief smiles to her face, new clothes that actually fit properly, dinner at restaurants they hadn't been able to afford since their early marriage, the premium cable package that let her watch the cooking shows that provided temporary escape from her depression. But perhaps most significantly, the money allowed Tom to maintain the illusion that he was a good husband who could provide for his wife during her darkest moments. When Angela expressed interest in adopting a rescue dog, Tom could afford the adoption fees and veterinary bills. When she wanted to visit her sister in California for the first time in 5 years, he could buy the plane tickets without checking their bank balance first. These moments of financial freedom felt like redemption, even though they were built on a foundation of systematic theft. But success bred ambition, and ambition bred carelessness. June 18, 2019. Carol Peterson sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the month's expenditure reports with an attention to detail that had served her well during 23 years in public school finance. Something felt wrong about the vendor payments, though she couldn't immediately identify the source of her unease. The amounts were reasonable, the descriptions were appropriate, but the frequency of certain types of repairs seemed unusually high. She began cross-referencing the payments with work orders and maintenance requests, her unease growing with each discrepancy she discovered. Brennan Maintenance Services had been paid $2,140 for facility repairs on November 15th, but no corresponding work order existed in the facilities management system. When she called the facilities manager, he had no record of approving any work from that company. North Star Cleaning Solutions had received $3,200 for specialized carpet cleaning on January 22nd. But when Carol walked through the building to inspect the carpets, they showed no signs of recent professional treatment. In fact, she remembered complaining to the facilities staff just last week about stains in the main hallway that had been there for months. Her heart began racing as the pattern became clear. Twin Cities Maintenance had been paid for HVAC repairs during the summer, when the heating system wasn't even running. Prairie View Services had received payment for window cleaning on days when it had been raining continuously. Each fraudulent payment was small enough to avoid triggering additional oversight, but together they represented a systematic theft that had been operating under her nose for months. Carol's suspicions crystallized when she realized that several of these mysterious vendors shared the same zip code, a detail that would have been invisible to anyone not looking for patterns. Her hands trembled as she printed out the vendor payment records. The evidence of her professional failure laid bare in black and white. She spent her lunch break driving to the address, only to find herself standing in front of a Mailboxes Plus location in a strip mall 15 miles from the school. The betrayal felt personal and professional simultaneously. Someone had been systematically stealing from the children she'd dedicated her career to serving, and they had used her own financial systems to do it. Carol sat in her car in that strip mall parking lot, staring at the mail store and feeling physically sick at the realization that she'd been completely deceived. That afternoon, Carol requested an emergency meeting with Superintendent Walsh and the district's business manager. By 4:30 p.m., they had identified $73,000 in questionable payments spanning 8 months. By 5:15 p.m., they had contacted the district's attorney and the local police department, officially beginning the investigation that would uncover the full scope of Tom's crimes. Detective Sarah Morrison of the Maple Grove Police Department had investigated financial crimes for 12 years, but the Lincoln Elementary case struck her as particularly brazen. The thief had operated with a level of sophistication that suggested intimate knowledge of the district's operations, yet had made basic mistakes that would inevitably lead to discovery. Whoever did this knew exactly how our system worked, Carol Peterson explained during Morrison's first interview on June 19th. They understood our approval processes, our vendor management procedures, even our payment schedules. This wasn't random. This was someone with access and detailed knowledge of our operations. Morrison's investigation initially focused on current and former employees with administrative access. Tom Brennan's name appeared on a list of staff members with after-hours building access, but his position as night custodian seemed to place him outside the realm of realistic suspects. The detective's initial interviews with school administrators painted Tom as a model employee, reliable, trustworthy, and completely lacking in the technical skills necessary to orchestrate such a sophisticated scheme. However, Morrison's 15 years of experience investigating white-collar crimes had taught her that the most successful thieves often appeared to be the least likely suspects. She began conducting deeper background checks on all employees with building access, looking for financial pressure points that might motivate criminal behavior. Tom's credit report revealed a pattern of medical debt, late payments, and maxed-out credit cards that painted a picture of desperate financial circumstances. The detective also discovered that Tom had recently opened several new bank accounts at different financial institutions across the metro area, a behavior pattern that often indicated money laundering or fraud. When she cross-referenced the account opening dates with the timing of suspicious vendor payments, the correlation was too significant to ignore. Morrison spent hours studying the district's security camera footage, looking for patterns and anomalies in employee behavior. The school's surveillance system was comprehensive but not perfect. Cameras covered most common areas, but had blind spots in certain offices and hallways. What the cameras did capture, however, was Tom's movements throughout the building during his night shifts. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On July 8, 2019, Morrison was reviewing security camera footage from the administrative wing when she noticed Tom's cleaning cart appearing in Carol Peterson's office on multiple occasions when Carol's computer would have been active and unattended. The timing correlated perfectly with several fraudulent transactions. More damning was footage from June 3, 2019, showing Tom spending nearly 12 minutes in Carol's office during what should have been a routine cleaning visit. The camera angle didn't capture the computer screen, but it clearly showed Tom seated at Carol's desk, his hands moving in ways consistent with typing rather than cleaning. The timestamp on this footage corresponded exactly with the creation of 3 fraudulent vendor payments totaling $1,400. Morrison also discovered that Tom had been researching business formation procedures and invoice templates on the school's computers during his breaks. The IT department's logs showed dozens of suspicious internet searches conducted from Tom's staff login credentials. How to create fake business license, invoice template download, and vendor payment approval process were among the search terms that appeared repeatedly in his browsing history. July 15, 2019. Tom arrived at work to find Detective Morrison waiting in the principal's office alongside Superintendent Walsh and Carol Peterson. The sight hit him like a physical blow. His knees nearly buckled as he realized that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. "Mr. Brennan, we need to ask you some questions about vendor payments," Morrison said, her voice professionally neutral, but her eyes sharp and knowing. Specifically, payments made to companies like Brennan Maintenance Services and North Star Cleaning Solutions. Tom's first instinct was to deny everything, but the weight of evidence made such denials impossible. The detective had traced the payments, identified the fake companies, and connected them to his personal banking accounts. The security footage showing him in Carol's office during the times when fraudulent transactions were processed provided visual confirmation of what the financial records had already revealed. The full scope of Tom's crimes became clear over the following investigation. Between October 2018 and July 2019, he had created 17 different shell companies and processed 127 fraudulent payments totaling $387,000. But this was only the beginning of the story. Under interrogation, Tom revealed that he had used his access to the school's computer systems to identify and exploit additional vulnerabilities. He had diverted portions of legitimate vendor payments to accounts he controlled, altered payroll records to create phantom employees, and even manipulated student activity fund balances to cover his tracks. The scope of his technical sophistication shocked even seasoned investigators. Tom had created a complex system of cross-referencing legitimate transactions with his fraudulent ones, ensuring that the district's books would balance on a month-to-month basis, even while he systematically drained their resources. He had learned to manipulate the accounting software's audit trails, making it appear that his transactions had proper authorization and documentation. One of his most ingenious schemes involved intercepting legitimate vendor payments and redirecting them to accounts he controlled. When Prairie Valley Janitorial Services was supposed to receive a $8,300 payment for summer deep cleaning, Tom would process the payment to his fake Prairie View Services company instead. The original vendor would eventually contact the district about the missing payment, but by then Tom had already cashed the check and created paperwork suggesting the payment had been processed correctly to a similarly named company due to a clerical error. Tom had also discovered how to manipulate the district's payroll system to create phantom employees. Michael Thompson and Sarah Davidson existed only in the computer system with direct deposit information that led to bank accounts Tom controlled. These fictional employees worked part-time hours that wouldn't attract attention. Substitute custodial staff who supposedly filled in during peak cleaning periods or handled special projects that didn't require detailed oversight. Most disturbingly, Tom had been skimming money from student activity funds, accounts designated for field trips, sports equipment, and arts programs. These funds were less closely monitored than the main district budget, making them ideal targets for small, frequent thefts. Over 2 years, he had stolen nearly $47,000 from accounts intended to enrich students' educational experiences, money that would have funded school plays, science fair projects, and graduation ceremonies. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation revealed a man who had become addicted to the intellectual challenge of defeating the district's security systems. Tom described the process of creating new fraudulent schemes as solving puzzles, finding ways to exploit weaknesses in systems that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of theft he was perpetrating. He had kept detailed handwritten notes about the district's financial procedures, vendor relationships, and approval processes, essentially creating a manual for institutional theft. The investigation's most shocking revelation came on August 2, 2019, when forensic accountants completed their comprehensive audit of the district's finances. Tom hadn't stolen $387,000 over 9 months. He had stolen $2.3 million over nearly 3 years, beginning with small manipulations in late 2016 that had grown progressively bolder and more sophisticated. The scope of the theft sent shockwaves through the Maple Grove community. Parents who had trusted the school district with their children and their tax dollar discovered that a man they'd barely noticed had systematically looted the institution's resources for nearly 3 years. The local media coverage was intense and unforgiving, with headlines like "Custodian's $2.3 million betrayal" and "How One Man Stole a School's Future." But the most devastating impact was on the people who had considered Tom a friend and trusted. Colleague Martha Henley, the principal who had praised his dedication for 15 years, felt personally betrayed and professionally humiliated. "I recommended him for Employee of the Month twice," she told reporters, her voice breaking with emotion. "I wrote letters of recommendation for him. I trusted him in my building, around our children, with keys to every room in this school. How do you recover from that kind of violation?" The criminal proceedings moved with bureaucratic efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the chaos Tom had created. On September 30th, 2019, he pled guilty to 17 counts of theft by swindle and 2 counts of identity theft. The plea agreement spared him the possibility of additional federal charges related to mail fraud and wire fraud, but guaranteed a substantial prison sentence. October 28, 2019. Tom stood before Judge Patricia Anderberg in Hennepin County District Court, wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to emphasize how far he'd fallen from his invisible position as night custodian. The courtroom was packed with community members, teachers, parents, and media representatives who had come to witness the conclusion of a case that had shaken their faith in public institutions. Angela sat in the gallery behind him, her face gaunt and aged by months of public scrutiny and private shame. She had lost 20 pounds since Tom's arrest. Her hair had gone prematurely gray, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who felt constantly watched and judged. Several times during the proceedings, she had to leave the courtroom when the emotional weight became too much to bear. The victim impact statements were devastating in their raw honesty and pain. Carol Peterson approached the podium with visible trembling, her 23-year career in public school finance forever tainted by her failure to detect Tom's systematic theft. "I've worked in school finance for over 20 years, she said, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "I've always believed that public service means protecting taxpayer resources with the same vigilance I would protect my own family's money. Mr. Brennan didn't just steal money. He stole my confidence in my ability to do my job. He stole my professional reputation and my peace of mind. I wake up every night wondering what else I missed, what other vulnerabilities exist that I haven't discovered yet. Principal Henley's statement focused on the broader impact of Tom's crimes on the entire educational community. This theft didn't just hurt our district financially, she explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. It damaged our community's trust in public education at a fundamental level. Parents now question every expenditure, every decision, every person we hire. Staff members feel like they're under constant suspicion. Students have lost faith in the adults who were supposed to protect and educate them. Mr. Brennan's actions created a culture of doubt and suspicion that will take years, maybe decades, to repair. The most powerful and heartbreaking statement came from Angela Brennan herself. She had spent weeks debating whether to speak at her husband's sentencing, ultimately deciding that silence would be another form of betrayal, this time of the community that had been victimized by her husband's crimes. Tom told himself he was stealing for me, for us, for our medical bills and our dreams of having a family, she said, her voice barely audible in the crowded courtroom. But he never asked me if I wanted him to become a thief. He never asked if I could live with knowing that our house, our car, our food was paid for with money stolen from children's education. He made me an unwitting accomplice to crimes that violate everything I believe about right and wrong. He stole from the school district, but he also stole my ability to respect the man I married, my ability to trust my own judgment, and my ability to live in the community where I was born and raised. Judge Anderberg listened to each statement with visible attention and emotion, taking notes and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of the case's complexity. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of both legal authority and moral judgment. Mr. Brennan, your crimes represent a profound betrayal of public trust that extends far beyond the monetary value of what you stole. You violated the faith that parents place in their children's schools, the trust that communities place in their public servants, and the confidence that citizens must have in their institutions for democracy to function properly. The judge sentenced Tom to 8 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 2/3 of his sentence. She noted that while Tom's personal circumstances had created understandable financial pressure, his response had been calculated, sustained, and had caused immeasurable harm to public trust. The court recognizes your personal struggles, Mr. Brennan, but those struggles do not excuse or diminish the calculated nature of your crimes or their devastating impact on innocent victims. Tom Brennan was released from prison on November 15, 2024, after serving 4 years and 11 months of his sentence. He returned to a world that had moved on without him, to a marriage that existed only on paper, and to a community that would forever remember him not as the dedicated custodian he'd once been, but as the man who stole their children's future. The Lincoln Elementary School District recovered approximately $340,000 through asset forfeiture and insurance claims, but the remaining $196 million was never recovered. The district was forced to cut art and music programs, delay facility improvements, and increase class sizes to manage the financial shortfall. The hidden cost of Tom's crimes continued to impact students who had nothing to do with his personal struggles. The ripple effects extended far beyond budget cuts. The district had to invest heavily in new financial oversight systems, hiring additional auditing staff, and implementing more complex approval processes that slowed down legitimate transactions. Every vendor payment now required multiple signatures and cross-verification procedures that turned routine purchases into bureaucratic obstacles. Teacher morale plummeted as staff members found themselves under increased scrutiny. Background checks became more invasive, computer access was restricted, and a general atmosphere of suspicion replaced the collegial trust that had previously characterized the school environment. Several longtime employees retired early, rather than adapt to the new culture of surveillance and documentation. The community's faith in public education suffered lasting damage. School board meetings became contentious affairs where parents demanded detailed accounting of every expenditure, no matter how small. The district's requests for funding increases were met with skepticism and hostility from taxpayers who questioned whether their money would be protected from future theft. Local businesses that had previously worked with the district found themselves subjected to extensive background checks and monitoring procedures that made collaboration more difficult and expensive. Some long-term vendor relationships ended because smaller companies couldn't afford the administrative burden of the new oversight requirements. The psychological impact on students was perhaps the most tragic consequence. Many children had known Tom personally. He had been a friendly presence in their school lives, someone who remembered their names and asked about their projects. Learning that this trusted adult had been stealing from their education created a sense of betrayal that extended beyond their understanding of financial crime. School counselors reported increased anxiety and trust issues among students who struggled to process how someone they liked could have hurt them so profoundly. Angela Brennan filed for divorce in January 2025, citing irreconcilable differences, but the legal proceedings revealed the full extent of how Tom's crimes had contaminated every aspect of their marriage. The house they lived in had been saved from foreclosure with stolen money. The car she drove had been purchased with fraudulent funds. Even the flowers he had bought her for their anniversary had been paid for, with money taken from children's education accounts. During the divorce proceedings, Angela discovered that Tom had been using her Social Security number to open some of the bank accounts associated with his fake companies, making her an unwitting participant in his crimes. She faced months of legal battles to clear her name and credit history, while dealing with the emotional trauma of learning that her entire recent life had been built on a foundation of systematic theft. Tom currently works at a warehouse in Minneapolis, earning $14 per hour and living in a studio apartment under a probation officer's supervision. He will spend the rest of his life repaying a debt that extends far beyond the $2.3 million he stole. A debt to the community that had trusted him, to the profession he had dishonored, and to the wife who had loved him before he chose crime over character. In quiet moments, Tom sometimes wonders if there had been another way to handle their financial crisis. Some path that didn't require betraying everything he'd once claimed to value. But those thoughts come too late to matter, serving only as reminders of how completely an ordinary person can destroy their life, with a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but led inevitably to ruin. The custodian who had once been invisible became infamous, proving that sometimes the most devastating criminals are hiding in plain sight, wearing janitor uniforms and carrying keys to places they were trusted to protect.